Most people think building a custom home starts with designing the actual house. But in reality, the process starts much earlier. And if you do this in the wrong order, you can create months of delays and sometimes tens of thousands of dollars of fixes that should have been avoidable from the beginning. My name's Jared, and I help people like you who want to build a custom home in the Aledo or surrounding areas. And today we're going to cover the 7 stages of how to build a custom home. Now, if this is your first time on the channel and maybe you've checked out my other Aledo-based content, hit the subscribe button if you are really thinking about a custom home and you want to understand the process better, because when you understand the process beforehand, it becomes much more manageable. And if you are getting serious about it, let's have a call, shoot me a text, give me an email, book some time on my calendar, and I'd love to help you get this process started in designing your dream home. Let's get into it. Okay, now the first step, and this is gonna sound cliche, but I'm gonna say you need to begin with the end in mind. And so what exactly does that mean? I think that you really need to think about your family's lifestyle that you're envisioning and understanding the limitations of your budget. So you need to be thinking about like the lifestyle your family likes to live and what those needs are that you're gonna have with this home. Again, that's kind of generic, but what does that mean? Okay, how many bedrooms do you actually need? What type or number of living spaces do you need? How many bathrooms? Do you want them all en suites? Are you okay with Jack and Jill? A home office, a guest suite. Do you plan to build a pool or a guest house? 1 story, 2 story? Do you want to have all the kids kind of separated? Do you want, the master suite in the far corner with the kids on the other side of the house? Do you want a 3-car garage? Do you want a 4-car garage? Do you want an outdoor living space? Do you like to host large gatherings and want a lot of open space? Or maybe do you prefer smaller gatherings and you want a more intimate setting, maybe a more traditional, like formal dining that's not, part of a great room. So this is important that, that you start thinking through your desires and your goals even before you sit down with the designer and the architect, because this is gonna play a lot into what it is you're building, obviously, but it even is gonna impact like construction costs. So you need to be able to go in early with a fairly clear vision, so that we can, as we're moving through this process, you're able to communicate effectively with the professionals you're using to figure out, okay, is what I want a realistic option for my budget? Because all of these things are going to impact the size, design, and maybe the materials and all that stuff in this home. And so 1, being able to clearly communicate with the architect and designer, that's super important. But 2, understanding how the size requirement, the layouts, a 2-story home is a little bit more cost efficient to build than a 1-story home. But if this is going to be your forever home, maybe you don't want a lot of square footage upstairs that you're not going to be able to utilize. Maybe you don't have kids in the house anymore, so you just a single story or maybe 1 flex space upstairs for if grandkids come over, right? So that's something to think about. And then realistically looking at your budget, okay, what kind of, mortgage at the end of the day am I comfortable with? Do I want a mortgage at all? So what kind of cash am I looking at for at the end of the day? At the end of the whole process, what kind of carrying costs do I want? How does that impact me on a monthly basis? So understanding the limitations and making sure that your goal fits with the budget lifestyle too, right? You don't want to be house poor. That's why I'm going to say begin with the end in mind and figuring out what that vision is as you move forward into the more practical physical steps that we're going to be getting to. All right, now if you haven't seen it already, I do have another video that is entirely around understanding what it costs to build a custom home in the Aledo area. So if you want to watch that, go check it out after finishing this video. But we're going to move to stage 2 now. Okay, now stage 2 is going to be assembling your team, and there are a bunch of professionals that you're going to be working with if you want this process to go smoothly, and I'm going to touch on each one of them and what is important to understand about what each one brings to the table. Okay, now let's start with the architect, because if you wanted to start entirely on your own, you don't have land, you don't know even when you're going to build, you don't have a builder, you could start with an architect first. Then the architect is going to help implement your vision into a practical design. And so with an architect, a good architect can do anything you want. But what I would say is it might be helpful to you if you are able to review some of their other designs to see if maybe what they have done fits within the general idea of what you want, to see if their natural style fits in with your vision. Because if an architect is great at ultra modern homes, it might be hard for them to effectively implement your vision of your traditional colonial style property that you're looking for, right? So that's something where, okay, yes, a good architect can do anything you want, but it might be a lot faster, easier, and less stress if you are working with a good architect that maybe naturally aligns with your vision and your style that you're looking for. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about the builder. And this is going to be the most important decision you make because the builder is ultimately the one responsible for building your home. They're responsible for the quality. They're responsible for the implementation of everyone else we work with, or the designer, the architect, whoever else, right? So builder's super important, and something that is important to understand, and I've actually had this conversation twice with clients in just the last week alone. Builders in Texas are not licensed by the state. They are not a licensed contractor. In Texas, the contracting trades that are licensed are plumbers and electricians and a couple others, but they're like ancillary, right? But some of the big three regarding your home are not licensed trades: roof, builder, and then foundation companies. So they're all considered general contractors in Texas, and general contractors have no licensing requirement. So, when I was in the foundation repair industry, we would kind of reference the guys who were just like one-man shops, or they didn't run a real business, or they didn't have a company, kind of like we call them chucking a truck, because you don't have to register with anybody. It's unwise, but they technically don't even have to go get insurance. That's something that's very important for you to think about. And I would also say that you want to be able to ideally see some of their product, right? Now, if they are exclusively a custom home builder and they don't do any specs at all, that can be a little bit hard because, you'd have to, find one of their current clients' homes that you could go look at and, make sure everyone's okay with it. Typically they are. I've had some really cool clients of a custom builder in the area. And I mentioned them in another video, but they met us at their own home and walked me and my client around to show them, one, they're very proud of their house, which they should have been. But two, they were honest and they were, had a lot of good praise to say about the builder building that home. So that's important. If you are trying to figure out how to pick a good builder, subscribe to the channel. That video will be coming out in a couple of weeks. So stick around and check that out. But picking a builder is going to be the most important thing you do in this process. Okay, next up on the list is going to be your designer. And now, depending on your needs and your preferences and your desires, a designer can play very different roles in this process. If you are someone who has a specific and an exact vision, you want to work with a designer who is going to help you pull that out of your brain and put it into a design. You want someone who is going to facilitate you like an expert and implement your design. If you are not someone who maybe is super creative on your own and you want a beautiful house that everyone will walk into and just love, maybe you want to find a designer that is able to maybe give options. Maybe they are able to give you a design style or angle that you're like, oh, I love that. Will you just give me options and I'll work, and I'll kind of pick and choose and tweak. That's another legitimate option to do. But there's two different people, right? And I've had people I've spoken with that went with one builder over another because they felt like the in-house designer was going to kind of steer them her direction with her implementation. And her preferences. That might be what you want. This client didn't want that. They had a very particular design that they wanted and that they envisioned, and they did not want people, trying to talk them out of it. And when you're building a custom home, that's what you get to do. You're paying for everything, you're making the decisions, you own it, it's yours. This is what you are building. So the right designer, I'm going to say, is going to make your life so much easier, right? Just so much easier. The one we're working with, we were a little bit more on the, hey, we really don't want to sort and sift through hundreds of different options for everything. And so she was able to give us, 2 design styles, like, moody or, bright and airy. And so we said, hey, we like, the kind of the bright and airy more look. And so she was able to give us, okay, hey, what about this? And so we're able to go through and have conversations with us. Hey, can we tweak this? Can we tweak that? And then it's like, hey, we love this. And we were able to get through the process in a fraction of the time than if we'd had to go through and, look at every selection at multiple tile stores and multiple cabinet stores and countertop stores. So it just comes down to what you want and what's best for you and how you're wired. Okay, so the next advisor on the list that you're gonna have to pick out and to work with is gonna be your lender. And this is probably something where I'm gonna say, this is the least important that you jive with this person on a personal level, because different banks have different loan types, right? Do you want a one-time close? Do you want to buy your land first and then finance your construction separate? Do you want the land purchase to be the first draw of your construction loan? Are you going to pay cash for something, do something else? When you are done with construction, do you want that loan to just turn into long-term financing? Or do you want to do a separate loan to take it out and make it a permanent financing? So you really need to shop banks to figure out which financial option is going to be best for you. And I'm not saying you should deal with a terrible lender individual, but with the designer, you want someone that you like and you're on the same page. With the architect, it's the same way. With the banker, it's a little bit different. Unfortunately, their product is much more of a commodity, and you need to make sure you're getting the exact commodity that is best for your finances, even if, the lender's a little bit slow to respond, or maybe you don't particularly care for his communication style. I'm not saying that you should deal with an a-hole or anything, but the actual product you're getting is what you need to think about when you're working with banks. Because, on these construction loans, a lot of times you're going to be working with more local and regional banks and not as often with the big guys, Chase, Wells Fargo, and all that stuff. So something to think about. And I will have another video coming out in a few weeks on understanding the loan types that you can be looking at. So again, subscribe to the channel, stick around, it'll come out, and that will really help you understand the different options you have if you're going the custom home route. Okay, so the last team member that you need to think about bringing on board is going to be your real estate advisor. And I actually do like to talk about this last, partly because that's where I typically come into play. All the other professionals have very defined and specific areas of expertise, and they don't always communicate super well with each other. When you hire a designer or when you hire an architect, when you hire a builder, they're not typically focused on your long-term goals, right? They're focused on what they do and what they do really well, and that's what you want. The real estate advisor, I come into play helping align all of those things to make sure they benefit you long-term. Because unless you're planning on literally dying in this house you're building, you probably want to understand if when you go to resell the home, are you going to fit within the normal boundaries of values, right? When you've completed the construction, you want to understand if you're going to have any issues with permanent financing. When you're looking at lot selection, maybe, you don't really care about the lot, you only care about the inside of the home, but do we want to make sure that something about your lot isn't going to be a deal killer for future buyers? All these things where the expert in their field might not be thinking about this thing over here. And so you really should consider having someone on your team that's going to bring it all together, have the good connections for you, at least have a short list of top builders to recommend, right? Have a couple of designers that are, well respected. Have an architect or two that they can connect you with, and then let you pick your people, but really making sure that everything's in alignment for your long-term goal that's going to be on your team that isn't, just a one-off here or there. Okay, so moving on to stage 3, and this is going to be finding and evaluating the lot you want to build on. And while many people, when we think of building custom homes, their first thought goes straight to the home, really it can be better to start with the lot and find a lot you really like and that will be a good fit long term. There is some side caveats to this. Maybe you have a very specific floor plan in mind. You think, I know exactly what I want my home to be like. I want it to be a single story, super wide, and that's what I want. That could impact the size of lot that's required. So there is some commingling of these stages all throughout this process a little bit, but these are separate stages. They just might overlap some. So there are a number of things that you should think about when picking a lot. I think picking a lot can be the best place to start because the lot is something you can't change, right? You cannot relocate your lot if it's next to a power line. That's something to think about. Many buyers don't like power lines. So we're gonna get into a couple of those things about the lots that you should be considering. Okay, and first on that list, we're gonna talk about lot size and location. So one, do you want a couple of acres or are you okay with like a third to a half of an acre? If you're okay on the smaller end of the spectrum, maybe you are gonna be looking in Klein Park in Walsh Ranch or La Dorada in Kelly Ranch. Those are gonna be two of the primary neighborhoods that you could build, nice custom homes in something on less than an acre. Or do you want something on 1 or 2 acres? If you're like, Jared, I really only want 1 acre and I don't want much else, that's gonna be hard to find in Parker County because after 2009, any neighborhood that was developed required 2 acre minimums for well and septic. Tarrant County is different. Tarrant County, you can still do 1 acre, have well and septic, and think the Bella Flora neighborhoods. You can still do new construction in Bella Flora, Bella Ranch, Bella Crossing. If there's lots available, there still are some on 1 acre. But over in Parker County, you're like, hey, Jared, no, I kind of want to be in Parker County. I want to be, closer to the Aledo schools. I want to be off FM5 somewhere. And I want to be in La Madera. I want to be in Summit Ranch. I want to be in, a gated community. You're going to be looking at probably 2 acres. Okay, so you're going to have to think about that. And with 2 acres, there's going to come some other things to consider, especially a little further out in the country where you might have some easements. So we're going to get into some of those as well in a moment. But first, let's talk about utilities because utility preference might actually impact where you want to buy, right? If you're buying out in the country on an acre or 2, you're going to be outside city limits without city utilities. You're going to have a private well, a private septic. You're probably going to have propane. And so that's something to think about. You're like, no way, I don't want any of that. I don't want the responsibility. Then you're going to need to think about buying in a neighborhood like Kelly Ranch or Walsh, Klein Park or La Dorada. But I assume most of you watching are probably at least open to the idea of something that's going to require well and septic. So another thing to think about is that that's one of the few things that's permitted in Parker County. So what you're going to have to do is like septic systems and wells have to be a certain distance from each other. And they also have to be a certain distance from other wells and other septic systems. And so if you're building on a lot that has neighbors that have already built things, right? The house I'm building has 1 completed home that's occupied next door, and it has a pad site that's getting ready to build on the other side. So when we went to place our well and think about where the septic system was going to go, we had to make sure that it fit in with the distance requirements to the neighbor that already had everything installed. Most of the time, that's not going to be a major issue, but that's why they require 2 acres. So we were able to get my preference, and it's most people's preferences, to have the wellhead in the front yard because that's something that you can make look nice, and then put the septic system and the spray heads in the backyard. That would always be preferable to me, but certain lot may not allow that. I've also seen a lot in one of the Bella Flora neighborhoods where neighbor's well was shoved way on the back side of their property, literally on the property line. So when I see that and it's only a 1 acre lot, my concern is that I'm not sure that you can figure out a proper distance for well and septic. Or maybe you have to, do an encasement on your well, so it's going to be more expensive. So there's things to think about when it comes to placement of utilities, or even just straight up very base level, what type of utilities you actually want. Okay, so next up is drainage and grading. And this really comes into play in some of the neighborhoods that are fairly hilly or have some elevation changes because one, you can get some awesome views, you can get some really cool lots, but if the actual pad site where you plan to build is not flat, you're gonna have to do some significant, grading work, which can add up. And then if you're not at the top of the hill, but maybe you're at the bottom of the hill, you need to think about drainage. And maybe even not if the house is at the bottom of the hill, but if there is significant drainage running across your property, there's something to think about. Are you gonna have to install a culvert? Like, is it just like normal neighborhood drainage, kind of like, the little dip between the road and in the first 15 feet of your yard? Or is it like a full on, drainage ditch and you have to engineer a culvert with a drive to go over that? So those things can add up. I mean, you could spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on like creating an accessible spot to get over that if you pick certain lots. So that's something to think about, is what kind of impact is this lot with drainage and grading work going to require? Maybe retaining walls, or maybe you need to build up the backyard or cut it out and you're gonna have to use a retaining wall to help it stay flat. So these are things to think about. These are real costs that add up. that unfortunately don't really get reflected on any sort of appraisal or value when you go to sell, but there are going to be hard costs associated with building your home. And if you want to watch a full video about how to identify and pick land in a little area, my next video coming out should be about how to pick that land for your custom home. Next up is possibly one of the most important things to consider, and that's going to be the neighborhood values, right? It can be a little bit difficult sometimes to make decisions about land when you're thinking about final value and what you want to build. It's like an equation, okay? So if the lot's going to cost this and I want to build that, where's that going to put my final price? How does that compare to the neighbors? Am I going to be significantly above them and have appraisal issues and then be overbuilt and then not get the full value if I ever have to go sell? Or am I going to be undersized, undervalued, and I'm not the home people are looking for when they do want to buy in the neighborhood in the future? So something to think about. It is a little bit of a balancing act, trying to figure out exactly what you can spend where and where that's going to put you at the end of the day to make sure that you are roughly in the range of the neighborhood that you're considering. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in regards to picking your lot is going to be understanding easements and what type of easements you are comfortable with. Because out in Parker County, especially in these big ranches that were sold and are being developed into neighborhoods and developments, easements are fairly common, especially if you're looking at maybe something that's 5, 10, 15 acres. I mean, I'd bet money that almost anything you look at is going to have some sort of easement on it. So what kind of easement are you okay with? So gas easements are very common. Now, are you okay with it running across the back edge of your property? Probably not a big deal. As long as you have a couple acres, it's not going to bother you. I have a client that's considering a 13-acre parcel, and it has a 20-foot gas easement that goes cuts north and south straight down the middle of the property. So first thought is like, ooh, that kind of stinks. Well, the middle of that 13 acres might not actually be the best place to put the home. For that specific property, it was, okay, the back corner might actually be a more private and secluded spot because the parcels on the back side are also very large parcels and their homes are not built anywhere near there. They're built closer to the road. So you could potentially have your home placed in a different part of the parcel if it was large enough and really have no issue with that easement. But drainage easements are common. I have a drainage easement running across the back of my lot because it's the back edge of the neighborhood, but it really wasn't even going to impact the playable backyard space. It was so far back. So I wasn't too worried about it. And then think about stuff that's maybe not even on your lot. I might have mentioned earlier, but if you have overhead power lines, I personally would not buy a lot that had a power line over it or like on the edge. So many buyers dislike it. They're concerned about it. They don't want to deal with it. And I get it. And so you decide, okay, well, how close to these power lines am I comfortable with, right? So that's something to think about. Is there a gas pad site near you? Is it visible? Are you going to be able to hear compressor sounds? So that's all things to think about when you're building these nice homes. And depending on the neighborhood, there may or may not be something nearby. Like I said, a lot of these ranches, they sold like mineral rights. And so they have these pad sites with compressor stations and stuff. And they're not like active as in a lot of people coming back and forth, but they are running. So, maybe they're gonna put a sound barrier up. They're gonna block it with trees. And I know they're doing that in neighborhoods like Aledo River. And so that's something to think about. What other things do I need to think about that could maybe be eyesores or slight like noise pollution, or what could potentially turn off a buyer that I can't change in the future? Okay, we are finally to stage 4, and this is going to be the design phase. And this really probably isn't going to be exclusively designer. There should probably be some level of designer and architect interaction, because some design selections can impact like the technical structure of the home. But you're going to be making decisions in this phase about flooring type, cabinetry type, like, okay, am I gonna have painted cabinets or do I want like wood stain cabinets? That can impact the quality of wood that you need to buy. What kind of countertops? What kind, size, shape, location of windows? What about built-ins? What about I'm gonna call it ceiling accoutrements, right? Do I want tray ceilings? Do I want box ceilings? Do I want, beams? Do I want tongue and groove in the ceiling? These are all things that we thought about and we're having to implement and figure out. What type of showers, baths, tile, what kind of stuff do we want there? This is, like I said, there's going to be some overlap in these stages because one thing that, learned from my experience, I ended up with my designer deciding that I actually wanted built-ins on either side of the fireplace. We just thought that that design would look really good. So we were going to remove the windows and put built-ins. Problem was, I didn't do this ahead of time, like hopefully you will. The form had already been prepared for the slab. And so what we're going to have to do is we're actually going to have to eat in, because built-ins are obviously going to be deeper than just a wall with windows. We're going to have to eat into the living room space a little bit. Now the living room's big enough that it's not going to matter. It's not going to feel small. So at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world, but we're going to have to eat into the intended living space in order to put built-ins where we want them. If we had made this decision before the architectural design was complete and we'd taken it to the engineers to get engineered, we would have just slightly adjusted the slab components, and the interior wall would have basically stayed the same, and we would have bumped out the exterior wall to give some space for these built-ins. So your architect and your designer are probably going to have some level of back and forth. If anything you're doing with a designer is going to impact the structure, the layout, or the flow of the actual home. Okay, stage 5, we're going to talk about builder pricing and contracting with the builder at this point, because now you should have finalized architectural designs. You should have a really good grasp on the design that you want to go with your designer, which should include actual material types and quality and level. And you should have a rough understanding of your own budget and that you're roughly fitting into there, right? And now the builder can provide accurate pricing. Any pricing you've gotten up to this point, you need to think of it as very rough estimates. So at this stage, this is where you really get to evaluate things like fixed contract price versus cost plus. You get to think about allowances on a fixed price and the range of that, builders' timelines, when can they start building. Maybe you haven't narrowed down the exact builder yet, so you can compare what they're going to be doing for you, right? Do you get a dedicated project manager? Are you going to be dealing directly with the owner? What is the expectation? What'll that look like? At this point, you don't want to have no idea who you're going to work with, but you don't necessarily have to already be committed to one builder. Hopefully along this process, maybe you have narrowed it down to one and you're just finalizing details and numbers and making sure it all works. But remember, any pricing you've received before this point should be thought of as a very rough estimate, because the builder can't quote you a reasonable estimate unless he knows what materials you want, what flooring, countertops, what type of, like I said, like accoutrements in the ceilings, like all that stuff really adds up until he understands how much, like outdoor living space, garage bays, and anything else, all super rough estimates. Okay, now stage 6 is going to be financing and construction loans. And it's important to remember that these types of loans work very differently than traditional mortgages. You're not typically going to come in and just buy a completed home, because a custom builder, even if they own the lot that you want to build on, is often going to require you to purchase the lot from them and then for you to finance the construction. That's going to be the major difference from custom versus semi-custom. If you missed the video that I did a couple weeks back, I do have a video on the differences to help you decide, if one's better for you than the other, but that's important to remember. Construction loans are going to work on a draw process. So for example, on mine, periodically after major milestones or significant work's been done, the builder sends me a filled out draw request form. I review it, I sign it, I send it to the bank, and the bank issues those funds to pay the builder for completed work. I can't stress that enough. Any builder I recommend is going to be trustworthy and great, but if you're picking someone who maybe is a little less known or unfamiliar with, and they start asking for advances from you personally, that could be a major red flag. And then separately from that issue, you need to be prepared for the interest carrying cost on these loans, right? Now, you're only going to be typically paying for the interest on the portion of the loan you were approved for as it gets paid out. So think of it more like a line of credit that you're pulling from and it goes up, as opposed to a traditional mortgage where they're issuing you all the money. So I'm paying interest only on the money as it's used. And in the beginning, it's not too bad. At the end, it's really not fun. So, my projected interest only payments from purchase of the lot to completion of the home is over $50,000. So not inconsequential. It is something to think about. You need to make sure that you have the cash available for that and you're not gonna be strapped. And ideally that it's not gonna stress you out as you're going through. This is another reason why it is important to make sure that the process goes as smoothly as possible once you start it, to keep those interest payments as low as possible. And then finally, in relation to the financing, is going to be understanding the appraisal process. If you are an early home in the neighborhood, that is going to be the most difficult time to get a strong appraisal or the most accurate appraisal, because they're going to have to go to other neighborhoods to find comps. So that's going to be something that, that I help with, that another real estate advisor helps with, making sure that you understand not what's the reality of the value that you should have at the end of the day, but what's the bank going to see? What's the bank going to use? And this is why you shouldn't build a custom home if you feel like you're too tight on cash. You really do need to make sure that you have plenty of cash to cover any differences, right? Maybe you were only planning on putting 20% down, but if the appraisal comes in low, you're gonna have to bring in extra cash. Or having 20% equity would be a better way to say that. So that's something to think about, is making sure you understand the realities of the appraisal, the expectation, and making sure you have the cash to make up any differences if there is a shortage, which hopefully there's not, but it is always a possibility. Okay, stage 7, we are finally building your home. This is the construction phase. This is the really exciting phase. This is where you get to take a step back, take the workload off, give it to the builder. And honestly, I'm gonna tell you to be involved as little as possible. The more involved you are in changing things, altering things, whatever else, the longer that you're gonna stretch out the build process. Now, I'm not saying don't check on the work to make sure it's done, to make sure nothing gets missed. But if you go in and you start changing things, you know, like I did, you wanna change, windows to built-ins, there's gonna be some headaches that are caused, right? So this is where you have the ability to be your own worst enemy, to be honest. So you wanna make sure that you've done all the work up front so that you don't need to go in and change things mid-build cycle. And on these types of homes, unless you're building a really large home, the construction phase itself is probably gonna take 8 to 12 months, right? Hopefully closer to 7 to 10, but you need to be prepared for that 8 to 12 month range, depending on size, footprint, maybe the builder's timeline. And so all that's going to come into play. And so there's, the construction goes into a whole bunch of phases that we're not going to get into. I've had another video on like how to build a custom home in Aledo, but you've got your like site prep, you've got your slab, you have your framing, you have your like sheathing going on with your roof, you've got windows, you'll do the mechanicals, the plumbing, the electrical, all that stuff. You'll have, the exterior, you'll have the interior design. So it really starts to get exciting, right? But something to remember, again, is ideally you've picked out basically everything you need and want so that your builder doesn't have to wait on you, or the builder doesn't have to redo anything that you want to change on the fly, which could increase costs for you or increase the timeline by maybe something you want requires another contractor to come out, requires a different contractor to wait, but then they have to go to another job. And now you've got a 1 or 2 week gap where that contractor has to come back later when they have free time on their schedule. Now you've added 2 weeks of interest payments, right? So something to think about, maybe not the end of the world, but you would like to avoid it if possible. Okay, so I thought I was gonna end at stage 7, but I'm gonna give you a bonus stage 8, and that's gonna be the final walkthrough with your builder post-completion. I say post-completion, I'm gonna say at substantial completion. Maybe there's a little bit here, a couple of things here and there, but you're gonna wanna do a final walkthrough with a builder. You're gonna wanna be able to do a punch list, make sure they get everything you want done before they get that final draw. Now, I would also recommend having a third-party inspection done for this process. Even if you love your builder, don't worry about offending them. You should do it. It is best practice. Have a third-party inspector come in and just make sure that everything's good. And I'll be honest, he's probably gonna find a couple of minor things, and that's normal. With everybody, that's gonna be normal. So I would highly recommend that for a couple of reasons, but one of the primary reasons being if your home is built outside city limits, there is no city inspection. There is no county inspection. There's not a certificate of occupancy that's gonna be issued to that home to verify that it meets all the requirements, right? It's just not something the county does in Texas, which is also surprising to some people who are moving from out of state. But what Texas does require as a state is that builders provide a certain level of warranty on new homes they sell or build, and that typically being a 1 year like workmanship warranty. a 2-year warranty on like the mechanicals of the structure, and then a structural warranty on the structure, which in Texas, the most important portion of the structure for that warranty is going to be the slab. There's actually 2 different levels, not 2. It used to be that Texas required a 10-year structural warranty. They've adjusted that down to 6, but many builders are still offering 10. So somewhere between 6 and 10 years is going to be the structural warranty that you should expect. And then it gets a little dicier as well, because technically builders can self-warranty. They can say, yes, I will warranty that myself. If you have an issue in 8 years and I have a 10-year warranty, I will fix it. But foundations, if they go bad, if they need work, are very expensive. So I would always prefer to see a third-party structural warranty, because if your builder that built your home goes out of business, then the structural warranty you have is not worth the paper it's written on. So third-party structural warranties, always my strong preference. Builders do typically self-warranty, the cosmetic or the workmanship, and then the mechanical side of that 2-year process. When you first start looking at building a custom home and you start to get into the weeds, it can really feel overwhelming. But once you understand how all the steps and stages and processes fit together, it becomes a lot more manageable. So if that's something you're thinking about, if you are thinking about building a custom home in the Aledo or surrounding areas, reach out, let's have a conversation. I'd love to help you make a great decision for your family and see if we're a great fit to work together to make your dream home come true.